When my husband died, my daughter-in-law brought lawyers to my house just 3 days after his burial. They sat at the dining table where my family used to dine together, laid down legal papers, and demanded that I sign over the company my husband and I had built over 30 years. They thought I was a lonely old woman with no one to rely on. But Walter, the man I loved my whole life, knew this would happen, and he prepared everything before he passed away. If this story resonates with you, hit like now and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any more true stories about dignity, betrayal, and awakening. Comment below with the name of the city or country you're watching. I want to know how far my story has traveled in the world. I never thought I would be the kind of woman who had to fight for what was already hers. For 31 years, I was Margaret Bennett, wife, bookkeeper, co-founder, the quiet half of everything Walter and I built together. I wasn't the one whose name was on the trucks. I wasn't the one shaking hands at diesel depots or negotiating contracts at 6 in the morning. But I was the one who sat at the kitchen table every night with a calculator and a legal pad, making sure every dollar went exactly where it needed to go. I was the one who told Walter when we could afford to hire a second driver and when we needed to wait another season. I was the one who gave up the vacation we'd been saving for 3 years so we could replace an engine that had no business being on the road anymore. I did all of that without complaint because I believed in what we were building. Not just a company, a life, a future. Something that would outlast the long hours and the cold winters and the years when we couldn't afford to fix the furnace in our own house. That belief carried me for 3 decades. And then, on a Tuesday evening in early October, Walter came home from a medical appointment and set his keys on the counter, and I knew, before he said a single word, that everything was about to change. He had always been a talker, my husband. Walter Bennett could fill a room with stories about road conditions in the middle of a dinner party. He could make a conversation about invoices feel like a campfire story. So when he walked through that door and didn't say anything, when he just stood at the kitchen counter and stared out the window at the land we'd spent 30 years turning into something worth looking at, I felt the silence like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "Walter," I said, "what did they tell you?" He didn't turn around. He just kept looking out that window. "Sit down, Maggie." "I don't want to sit down. Tell me what the doctor said." "Sit down, please." The way he said please, that was what did it. Walter Bennett did not say please like that. He said please, the way most men say fine or whatever you want, casual, quick. But that night he said it like it cost him something, like he was already spending energy he didn't have left to spend. I sat down. He stayed at the window for another long moment. Then he turned around, and I saw it. Not tears, not yet, but something close to it. His eyes had that look people get when they've already had the cry, when they've used it all up somewhere else, and now they have nothing left but the raw, hollow feeling underneath. "They found something," he said. "In my pancreas." I heard the words. I understood what they meant individually, but for a moment they didn't connect like puzzle pieces that belong to different boxes. "Found something," I repeated. "Cancer, Maggie." The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming. "How bad?" He looked at me for a long time, and then he said, "Let's talk tomorrow. I just need tonight." So I let him have tonight. I sat in that kitchen alone after he went to bed, and I did not allow myself to fall apart, because one of us had to stay functional, and I had spent 31 years being the functional one. I made myself a cup of tea I didn't drink. I stared at the legal pad on the counter, the one still covered in last month's expense notes, and I thought about how we had survived so many things. Droughts, a recession that nearly took everything, a fire that destroyed 2 of our trucks in the same week. The year Ethan went through that terrible stretch in his 20s that cost us more money and more sleep than I ever admitted to anyone. We had survived all of it. Surely we could survive this. That was what I told myself that night. I was wrong about almost everything. Walter didn't tell me the full truth for 3 weeks. He went back to appointments I didn't know about. He made phone calls behind closed doors. He started spending time with Harold Kessler, the attorney who had helped us incorporate the company 15 years ago. And when I asked him why Harold kept calling, he told me it was about updating some paperwork. I believed him. I don't know why, exactly, except that I had spent 31 years trusting this man completely, and old habits are not easy to break even when something in your gut is screaming at you. The screaming got louder in week 2. I found a folder on the desk in his office. I wasn't snooping. I was looking for our vehicle registration renewal because the deadline was coming up. But the folder was sitting right there, half open, with the word trust printed across the top in Harold Kessler's letterhead. I didn't open it. I put it back exactly where I found it and walked out of that room and told myself it was nothing. But I knew it wasn't nothing. Week 3, Walter sat me down at the dining room table. The same table where we had signed the papers on this farmhouse in 1993. The same table where we had told Ethan he was getting a little brother and then had to tell him 6 months later that we'd lost the baby. The same table where Walter had laid out his plan to buy the 3rd truck, and the 5th, and the 12th. Every major moment of our shared life had happened at that table. He sat across from me, folded his hands the way he always did when he was about to say something serious, and he told me the truth. Terminal pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. The doctors were talking about months, not years. He had known for almost a month. He had not told me because he needed time to prepare, not emotionally, but strategically. Strategically, I said. The word came out flat. You kept this from me for a month to be strategic. I kept it from you because I needed to think clearly before you and I both fell apart, he said. And I can't afford to fall apart yet, Maggie. There are things I have to do first. Things you have to do. I could hear myself repeating his words back to him, and I couldn't stop. My brain had stopped generating original sentences. Walter, you're telling me you're dying and you're talking to me like it's a business problem. It is a business problem, he said. That's exactly what it is. And if I don't solve it before I'm gone, you're going to spend the rest of your life paying for it. That stopped me. What does that mean? He looked down at his folded hands, and then he told me about Vivian. My daughter-in-law had always made me uneasy in a way I could never fully justify. She was beautiful, Vivian Cross. She had the kind of confidence that looks like warmth from a distance but feels like marble when you get close to it. She had married our son Ethan 4 years ago, and from the beginning there was something about the way she looked at our company, not at us, not at the family, but at the company, that sat wrong with me. I had written it off as my own jealousy. Ethan was my son, and I had not entirely made peace with sharing him. I told myself I was being unfair to her. I invited her to family dinners. I complimented her cooking even when it needed salt. I was the bigger person because that was what the situation required. And the whole time, Vivian was working. Walter told me everything that night at the dining room table. He told me he had noticed her asking questions she had no business asking. Questions about ownership percentages, about what would happen to the company if something happened to Walter, about whether there was a succession plan in place. He told me that 6 weeks before his diagnosis, she had called the office directly and asked to speak to our operations manager about future leadership arrangements. Dennis, our operations manager, had mentioned it to Walter in passing, thinking it was nothing. Walter had not thought it was nothing. She knew, he said, or she suspected. She was watching me, Maggie, watching for signs. That's not possible, I said. But even as I said it, I was thinking about the way Vivian had looked at Walter the last time they were in the same room together. That careful, measuring look she'd had when she thought no one was paying attention to her. She couldn't have known. We didn't even know. I don't know how much she knew, Walter said, but I know what she was doing, and I know our son well enough to know he wasn't going to stop her. That was the part that hurt worst. Not Vivian's ambition. I could understand ambition, even the ugly kind. What I could not absorb, sitting at that table in the home we had built with our hands and our years, was the image of my own son standing to the side while his wife reached for everything his father had worked for. Ethan had always been the kind of man who needed someone to tell him what to do. As a boy, it had been endearing. He was sweet and agreeable and so eager to make everyone happy. As a grown man, it had started to look different. He had let 3 jobs fall apart because he couldn't navigate conflict with supervisors. He had gotten into financial trouble in his late 20s that Walter and I had quietly helped him out of twice without ever telling him how much it cost us. And then he had married Vivian, and suddenly he had someone to make all his decisions for him, and for a while I had thought maybe that was what he needed. I had been so profoundly wrong. "What do you want to do?" I asked Walter. "I've already started," he said. He walked me through it over the next 2 hours. Harold Kessler had been working with him for weeks already. The voting control for Bennett Transportation had been quietly restructured, legally, properly, with documentation that would hold up in any courtroom, so that 100% of decision-making authority rested with me. Not split, not shared. Mine. If anyone wanted to challenge a business decision after Walter was gone, they would have to go through me. A separate portion of the company's value had been placed into a trust for Ethan, not managed by Ethan, not controlled by Ethan, and entirely inaccessible to anyone Ethan was married to. It was structured specifically to provide for our son without giving anyone else a handle to grab onto. I listened to all of this with my hands flat on the table, because if I didn't hold on to something solid, I was not sure what I would do. "You've been planning all of this," I said. "For weeks." "Yes." While I thought you were dealing with your diagnosis." "I was dealing with my diagnosis," Walter said quietly. "This is how I deal with things. You know that about me." I did know that. It was the thing I loved most about him, and sometimes the thing that drove me the most completely insane. Walter Bennett did not have emotions so much as he had action plans. When something went wrong, he did not sit with it. He started solving it. When the recession hit us in 2009 and we were 3 months from losing everything, he did not cry. He called Harold, he called our banker, he renegotiated 3 contracts in the same week, and he came home and told me we were going to be fine. And we were fine because he made us fine. This was the same thing, the last version of the same thing. "There's one more piece," he said. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and he pulled out an envelope, plain white. My name written on the front in his handwriting. Not printed, handwritten, which Walter almost never did because his handwriting had always been terrible and he knew it. "Margaret, I need you to keep this somewhere safe," he said. "And I need you to promise me you won't open it until you need to." "How will I know when I need to?" He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "You'll know." I took the envelope. I held it for a moment, looking at my name in his terrible handwriting, and then I put it in the pocket of my cardigan, and I told myself I would not cry until he left the room. I managed to wait until he went upstairs. Then I sat at that table alone with the envelope in my pocket, and I cried in a way I had not cried since I was a girl, loud and ugly and without any of the composure I had spent a lifetime constructing. And when I was finished, I washed my face at the kitchen sink, and I put the envelope in the fireproof lockbox in my closet, and I went to bed. Walter was already asleep. I lay beside him in the dark and listened to him breathe and thought about 31 years, about diesel fuel and legal pads, and a kitchen table that had held every important moment of our shared life. And I made myself a silent promise. Whatever came next, I was not going to lose what we built. I was not going to let anyone take it. Walter had spent the last of his strength making sure I could fight. The least I could do was be ready to. The weeks after that conversation were the strangest of my life. I was living 2 realities at once. On the surface, I was the woman watching her husband get sicker, measuring out medications, driving him to appointments, learning how to talk to oncologists without crying in the hallway afterward. I was making soups he couldn't finish and changing the subject when he tried to apologize for not eating. I was doing all the things a wife does when the man she loves is running out of time, and I was doing them the only way I knew how, with my hands busy and my feelings managed and my face arranged into something that looked like calm. Underneath that, I was terrified in a way I had no language for, not just of losing Walter. I had begun to accept that in the slow, grinding way you accept something that feels impossible, a little more each day, like learning to carry a weight that doesn't get lighter, but your body adjusts to the shape of it. What terrified me on a different level entirely was the thing Walter had told me at the dining room table. Vivian was moving. She had been moving before we even knew Walter was sick. And now that the diagnosis was real and the timeline was shortening, I could feel the pressure of her attention like a change in the air before a storm. something invisible and electric that told you to get inside before the sky opened up. I did what Walter had asked me to do. The first thing I did was call my own attorney. Not Harold Kessler, who was handling Walter's estate planning. I needed someone who was entirely mine, someone whose loyalty wasn't divided. A woman named Patricia Okafor had handled a real estate matter for me years ago, and she had impressed me then with her directness. I called her office on a Wednesday morning while Walter was napping, and I sat in my car in the driveway because the farmhouse had ears and I was not yet sure whose they were, and I told her everything. Patricia listened without interrupting. That alone was worth the retainer. "First thing," she said when I finished, "don't move anything dramatically, no sudden large transfers. That creates a paper trail that can be characterized as hiding assets, and the last thing you need is to give anyone ammunition." "Walter already restructured the voting control," I told her. "Good. That's clean, that's documented, that's solid. What about your personal accounts?" "We've always kept joint accounts." There was a pause on her end that told me more than her words would have. "Margaret, I want you to open a personal account in your name only, not to hide anything, to protect yourself. There's a difference. You have 31 years of contribution to this company. That entitles you to security, and security means having access to resources that can't be frozen or contested while a legal dispute is ongoing." I thought about that for a moment. "Vivian doesn't have legal standing to freeze anything," I said. "She's not a partner. She's not on any documents." "Not yet," Patricia said. "But if Ethan contests the estate, Vivian becomes relevant. And if she can demonstrate that assets were commingled, that the line between company money and personal money was blurry, she has a foothold. Take the foothold away." So I opened an account. I did it quietly, at a bank across town on a Thursday afternoon when I told Walter I was going grocery shopping. I sat across from a young branch manager who could not have been more than 30, and I told him I needed a personal account for estate planning purposes. And he nodded and typed things into his computer and asked me to initial in 4 places. And the entire time I was thinking about how strange it was, how completely surreal it was, to be doing this while my husband was home in bed, while my son's wife was making phone calls she didn't think anyone knew about, while the company Walter and I had built from one tired truck, and a prayer was sitting there like a thing to be divided up by people who hadn't earned a single mile of it. I initialed in all 4 places and drove home and put the groceries away and made Walter a cup of the tea he actually liked. And I did not tell him about the account because there were things he was carrying that I didn't want to add to. He had enough. The dynamic between Ethan and Vivian had been something I had watched shift gradually over 4 years, the way you watch a creek change course after a flood, so slowly that you almost don't notice until one day you look and realize the water isn't where it used to be. Ethan had been a certain kind of man before Vivian. Uncertain of himself, yes, that had always been true, but warm. He used to call me on Sunday evenings just to talk, no particular reason, just the habit of connection he'd carried from childhood. He used to drive out to the farmhouse on a Saturday and spend the afternoon helping Walter with whatever needed doing, not because Walter asked, but because he wanted to. He had a gentleness about him that I had always loved, even when it frustrated me, even when I wished he would push back harder against the world. Vivian had mistaken his gentleness for softness, and then she had used it. It hadn't happened all at once. First, it was small things. He started declining Sunday calls because we have plans. Then the Saturday visits became monthly, then occasional, then something that happened at holidays when there was no convenient excuse not to. He stopped talking to Walter about business, even though Walter had always loved including him, always hoped Ethan would want to be more involved with what they'd built. When I mentioned this to Walter once, about a year into the marriage, he had shrugged in a way that meant he had thoughts he wasn't sharing. "She doesn't like him spending time here," Walter said. "That's not... Ethan makes his own decisions." Walter had looked at me with the patient expression of a man who has decided not to argue about something he knows he's right about. "Okay, Maggie." I had not pushed it. I told myself I was respecting Ethan's marriage, respecting his right to build his own life on his own terms. I told myself it wasn't my place. Watching from a distance as Vivian slowly repositioned my son away from everything that had grounded him, that had been its own kind of grief. The kind that doesn't announce itself but accumulates until one day you reach for something that used to be there and find empty space. Now, with Walter sick and the company suddenly vulnerable, that grief had curdled into something harder. I was angry, not just at Vivian, though the anger toward her was substantial and specific and getting less polite by the day. I was angry at myself for the years I had spent being diplomatic and fair-minded and willing to give the benefit of the doubt. I was angry at the instinct that had told me something was wrong and the other instinct that had told me not to trust the first one. I was angry at the whole long, patient, reasonable version of myself that had looked at what Vivian was doing and decided it was probably nothing. It had been something. It had been something the entire time. The call I wasn't supposed to know about happened on a Friday afternoon in late November. Walter was sleeping. I was in the kitchen going through vendor invoices. Even with everything happening, the company's administrative work still had to be done, and Walter had asked me to stay on top of it because he didn't want Dennis fielding questions about things going sideways. When my cell phone rang, it was Dennis himself. Dennis Farrow had been with us for 11 years. He had started as a dispatcher, moved to operations coordinator, and was now managing a team of 12 people and a fleet that had grown considerably since his first day. He was loyal in the uncomplicated way of someone who had been treated fairly for a long time and knew it. "Margaret," he said, "I wasn't sure whether to call you." That phrase, "I wasn't sure whether to call you," is never followed by good news. "Tell me," I said. He took a breath. "Vivian called the office again this morning. She asked to speak with me directly. I took the call." I set down the invoice I was holding. What did she want? She said she was calling on behalf of Ethan. She said she understood Walter's health situation was serious, and she wanted to have a conversation about, she called it, transition planning. She asked me whether I'd be interested in staying on with the company under new leadership. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, I could hear wind against the windows. "New leadership," I said. That's the phrase she used. I told her I wasn't the right person to have that conversation with and that she should speak with you or Walter directly. She said she would be in touch through the appropriate channels. The phrase appropriate channels hit me like a door slamming. "Dennis, I need you to write down everything she said, everything, the exact wording as best you can remember it. Date it, sign it, and send it to my personal email, not the company account. Can you do that?" "Already did," he said. "I sent it 20 minutes ago. I just wanted to call you so you'd know it was coming." I sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were completely steady, which surprised me because inside I felt like something had cracked open. "She's been doing this for a while, hasn't she?" I said. It wasn't really a question. Dennis was quiet for a moment. "She called twice before. Once about 4 months ago, once about 6 weeks ago. The first time I brushed it off, the second time I mentioned it to Walter and he told me to document it and not engage. I'm sorry I didn't loop you in then. Walter seemed to have a handle on it, and I didn't want to—" "It's okay," I said, and I meant it. "You did the right thing by calling me now." After I hung up, I sat at that table for a long time. 4 months ago. She had started calling 4 months ago, which was before Walter's diagnosis was confirmed, before we even had the word cancer in our vocabulary. She had been watching him that closely. She had noticed something in the way he moved, or the way he looked, or the way he talked about the future. And she had started making calls. She had begun positioning herself before the man was even officially sick. I thought about what Walter had said. I don't know how much she knew, and I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the November wind outside. How had she known to start watching? I didn't have an answer to that yet, but I was going to find one. I didn't tell Walter about Dennis's call that evening. I told myself it was because he needed rest, and that was partially true. But the fuller truth was that I wasn't ready to hand him something else to worry about. He was already carrying the weight of his own death. He was already managing Harold Kessler and the restructuring documents, and the 1,000 small administrative things that had to happen to put his affairs in order. I had watched him spend his dwindling energy on protecting me, and the very least I could do was start protecting him back, which meant handling some of this myself. That night I emailed Patricia Okafor with everything Dennis had told me. Her response came the next morning before I'd finished my first cup of coffee. "This is significant. New leadership is a loaded phrase. She's essentially announcing intent. The fact that she's approaching your employees directly is a form of pressure. She's trying to build internal support before any legal challenge. I want to schedule a call this week. We had the call on Monday. Patricia walked me through the landscape of what a legal challenge might look like if Ethan, meaning Vivian operating through Ethan, decided to contest Walter's restructuring of the company. They would argue that Walter wasn't of sound mind when he made the transfers, she said. That's absurd. He was completely clear-headed. I know that and you know that, but it's a standard argument and it requires defending. We need testimony from Harold Kessler about Walter's condition at the time of the restructuring. We need the medical records to show competency. And we need those records to be airtight, because if there's any ambiguity, Vivian's attorney will find it. If there's an attorney, I said, Margaret. Patricia's voice was kind but direct. There's going to be an attorney. She's been making calls to your employees for 4 months. She didn't do that without advice. She was right. Of course she was right. I spent the next 2 weeks quietly gathering everything Patricia asked for. Records, documentation, a sworn statement from Harold Kessler about the circumstances under which Walter had instructed the restructuring. Harold was cooperative and thorough and visibly angry on our behalf, which I appreciated more than I could say. He had known Walter for 20 years. He did not take kindly to the implication that Walter had been manipulated or impaired. He was one of the clearest clients I've had in 40 years of practice, Harold told me, with the contained fury of a man who was too professional to say what he actually wanted to say. If anyone tries to argue otherwise, I will tell them exactly that under oath. I hugged him in his office parking lot, which surprised us both. Harold was not a hugging kind of person, but he hugged me back briefly, and we didn't mention it again. December arrived and Walter got worse faster than we'd expected. The oncologist had given us a range, several months, possibly approaching a year with certain treatments, but Walter had declined aggressive intervention almost immediately. He'd explained his reasoning to me with the same methodical calm he brought to every major decision. The treatments would buy time, but not much of it, and they would take what time remained and fill it with misery. He wanted to be present. He wanted to be there, not diminished and hollowed out by chemicals, for whatever months were left. I had argued with him about it exactly once. He had listened to everything I said, and then he had said, I know, Maggie, I know. And something in the way he said it made me understand that this conversation was over, not because he was dismissing me, but because his mind was made up in the deep bedrock way that Walter's mind got made up about things that mattered. I let it go. It was the hardest thing I had ever let go. So December arrived and Walter was spending more time in bed and less time at the window, and the house had taken on a quality of stillness that felt different from the natural quiet of a farmhouse in winter. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath. Ethan came to visit twice that month. Both times, Vivian came with him. The first visit was fine in the surface way that things are fine when everyone is performing normalcy with great effort. Vivian was warm and attentive and brought a dish she had cooked, something elaborate with herbs that I was certain she had spent the afternoon preparing specifically so she would have something to bring. She kissed Walter on the cheek. She said it was good to see him looking well, which was a thing you could only say if you weren't paying attention to how Walter was actually looking. But I said nothing, because this was my husband's limited time, and I was not going to spend it making the visit into a confrontation. After dinner, while Ethan was sitting with Walter in the bedroom, Vivian followed me into the kitchen. I was at the sink, rinsing dishes, and I heard her footsteps behind me, and I thought, here it is. Margaret, she said, can I talk to you for a minute? Of course, I said. I kept my hands in the soapy water and my face pointed at the window above the sink. I just want you to know, she said, that Ethan and I are here for you. Whatever you need. We want to help with everything. The house, Walter's care, the company. You shouldn't have to manage all of this alone. I turned around and I looked at her. She was standing with her arms crossed loosely, leaning against the counter, with an expression that was calibrated to read as concern. She was very good at this. If I had seen that expression in a photograph without knowing anything about what she'd been doing for the past 4 months, I might have believed it. That's very kind, I said. I mean it. Ethan is worried about you. We both are. And the business, She paused, and in that pause I felt the real conversation beginning. The business is a lot for one person to handle, especially under this kind of stress. We'd really like to be more involved, help take some of that weight off. I dried my hands on the kitchen towel. I folded it. I set it on the counter. Vivian, I said, keeping my voice even. Walter and I have been running this company together for 30 years. I know exactly how to manage it, but I appreciate your concern. She held my gaze for a moment, and then she smiled, a specific kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere above her lips, and said, "Of course, just know the offer stands." She walked back toward the hallway, and I turned back to the sink, and I stood there staring at the dark window above it, and thought about 4 months of phone calls to our employees and the phrase new leadership and the smile that had just crossed her face. The offer stands. I knew what the offer was. It wasn't help. It was a foothold. It was the same incremental positioning she'd been doing with Ethan for 4 years. Make yourself useful. Make yourself necessary. Make yourself so embedded in the operation of something that removing you starts to seem more trouble than it's worth. She was not going to get a foothold. Not in my kitchen and not in my company. But I smiled back at her retreating figure and said, "Thank you, Vivian." And I let her think she'd handled me perfectly. Awase. The second December visit was shorter and harder. Walter was having a difficult week, and the visit felt strained from the moment Ethan and Vivian walked through the door. Walter was in the bedroom and not up for much conversation, and Ethan sat beside him looking like a man who didn't know what to do with his own hands, and Vivian stood in the doorway of the bedroom because I had not invited her further in. At some point while Ethan was with his father, Vivian cornered me in the hallway near the office door. "I know you've been speaking with an attorney," she said. The directness of it caught me off guard. I had not been expecting her to drop the warmth so quickly, and for a moment I just looked at her. "Everyone with a complicated estate speaks with an attorney," I said. "Patricia Okafor isn't an estate attorney," Vivian said. "She's a litigation specialist." I felt the ground shift slightly beneath me, not because she was threatening me, but because she had done her homework. She knew who Patricia was. She had been paying enough attention to know the name of my attorney and her practice specialty. "I wasn't aware I was required to explain my legal choices to you," I said. "You're not." She looked at me steadily. "I'm just saying this doesn't have to be a fight. Ethan has a right to be involved in his father's company. That's all we've ever said." "Ethan is welcome to be involved," I said. "He always has been. Walter spent years trying to get him more engaged. The door was open." Something moved behind her eyes. A calculation. "That was then. Things are different now." "They are," I agreed. And I smiled at her and walked back toward the kitchen, because I was done with that conversation. But I did not sleep well that night. Not because I was afraid of Vivian exactly. I had Patricia and Harold and 31 years of documentation on my side, and whatever she was planning, we were ready for it. I didn't sleep because of what she'd said. Ethan has a right. Ethan. My son, with his gentle hands and his uncomfortable silences, and his inability to sit beside his dying father without looking like he wanted to disappear. What did Ethan actually want? Not Vivian's version of what he wanted. What did Ethan want? I realized, lying in the dark with Walter breathing slowly beside me, that I didn't know the answer to that question anymore, and that might have been the most painful thing of all. Walter died on a Thursday afternoon in late January. He had been declining for 2 weeks in the way the hospice nurses had described, gradual, mostly peaceful, the body making a series of quiet decisions the mind had already accepted. I was holding his hand when it happened. The room was cold the way old farmhouses get cold in January, no matter how high you set the heat. There was thin winter light coming through the curtains. Walter's breathing had been shallow and irregular for most of the morning, and then at some point in the early afternoon it simply stopped, and the room became a different kind of quiet than any quiet I had ever experienced. I sat there for a long time before I called anyone. I don't know exactly how long. The winter light moved across the floor in that slow way it does, and I sat beside my husband and held his hand and thought about 31 years. I thought about the first truck, the one with the cracked windshield that we drove for 2 years before we could afford to fix it. I thought about the kitchen table and every major moment that had happened around it. I thought about the night he sat across from me and folded his hands and told me the truth, and how I had spent the weeks since trying to honor everything he'd done to protect what we'd built. I thought about the envelope in the fireproof lockbox in the closet. Not yet, I told myself, not yet. I called hospice first. Then I called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, and I told him his father was gone, and he made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a child. This low, broken sound that had no word in it, just grief stripped of everything else. And for a moment, he was just my son again, and I wanted to reach through the phone and hold on to him the way I had when he was small and hurt, and the world had not yet taught him how to hide it. Come home, I told him. Just come home. He came. He walked through the door 2 hours later with his eyes red and his face wide open in a way I hadn't seen in years, and he held me in the hallway and we stood there together for a long time without saying anything. Vivian was behind him. She let him have the moment. I will give her that. She stayed back and let him have his grief without managing it. But she was there, and I could feel her presence the way you feel a draft from a window you can't see. The next 3 days were a blur of arrangements and phone calls and people bringing food to the farmhouse and the specific exhaustion of grief that is also administrative work. Dennis called twice to express condolences and ask about the coming week's schedule because the company did not stop moving just because Walter was gone, and I appreciated the steadiness of it, the way the ordinary world kept insisting on itself even in the middle of something devastating. I moved through those days doing what needed to be done, because that was what I knew how to do. Because Walter had spent 31 years building something in me that knew how to function under pressure, and because somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the grief and the exhaustion, I was waiting. I didn't know exactly what I was waiting for. I would find out on the 4th day after the funeral when Ethan came to the farmhouse with Vivian and a man I had never seen before. A man in a very good suit carrying a leather briefcase, and everything Walter had warned me about walked through my front door and sat down at my dining room table. The man in the good suit had a name, Richard Hale. He introduced himself at my front door with a handshake that was firm in the rehearsed way of someone who has been taught that a firm handshake conveys authority, and he handed me a business card with the name of a law firm I didn't recognize, Hale and Morrow, with an address in the city 40 miles from the farmhouse. He was somewhere in his mid-40s with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that suggested he billed by the hour and wanted you to feel that every hour was worth it. I took his card. I looked at it. I looked at Ethan. My son was standing slightly behind Vivian, which told me everything I needed to know about who had arranged this visit. Come in, I said. Because what else do you say? You cannot turn your own son away from the door of his father's house 4 days after the funeral. There are things grief requires of you, and one of them is that you do not become the villain in someone else's story by refusing common courtesy, even when that courtesy is being weaponized against you. So I let them in. I led them to the dining room. Not the living room, not the kitchen, not anywhere that felt informal or domestic. The dining room, with the long table and the straight-back chairs and the overhead light that made everything look official. If we were going to have this conversation, we were going to have it in a room that felt like what it was, a negotiation. I sat at the head of the table, the head. Walter's chair was at the other end, and I had made a decision without even thinking about it. I was not going to sit in the middle. I was not going to position myself as anything other than the person who owned this table and everything it represented. Vivian noticed. I saw her eyes move from me to the chair and back. Richard Hale set his briefcase on the table and unlatched it with 2 precise clicks. Mrs. Bennett, he said, first, on behalf of my clients, please accept my sincere condolences for your loss. Thank you, I said. I'll get to the point because I think that's what everyone prefers in a situation like this. Please. He pulled a document from his briefcase and slid it across the table toward me. I did not pick it up. I looked at it from where it lay, several pages, dense with text, with signature lines at the bottom marked with small adhesive flags. My clients, Ethan and Vivian Bennett, have retained me to represent their interests in the matter of Walter Bennett's estate. Specifically, they have concerns about certain corporate restructuring actions taken by Walter in the months preceding his death. I let the silence sit for a moment before I responded. I had learned from years of negotiating contracts at Walter's side that silence was its own form of pressure, and that the person who rushes to fill it is usually the one with less confidence. "What kind of concerns?" I said. Richard Hale folded his hands on the table. "It is my client's position that the transfer of voting control to you, executed approximately 3 months before Walter's death, was conducted under conditions that may not reflect Walter's full and unimpaired judgment. Given the severity of his diagnosis at that time, they would like to explore whether the restructuring can be revisited." I looked at Ethan. He was looking at the table. "Ethan," I said. He looked up. His eyes were still red from crying, or maybe they were red again. He had the look of a man who had not slept in 4 days, which was probably true. And underneath the exhaustion, there was something else. Something that looked like shame, though he was working hard not to let it show. "Ethan," I said again, "is this what you want?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Vivian. That look, that instinctive, reflexive look at his wife before he could answer a question from his own mother, landed in my chest like something physical. "We just think," Vivian said smoothly, before Ethan could locate any words, "that it's fair to have everything reviewed. Walter was very sick, and decisions made under that kind of stress—" "Vivian," I said. I said it quietly. I asked Ethan. The table went silent. Ethan pressed his lips together. He looked for a moment like a 16-year-old boy caught between 2 adults who were both expecting things from him that he didn't know how to give. He started, stopped. "I just want to make sure everything is right, Mom. That's all." That's all. The words were so inadequate for what was happening that I almost laughed. My husband of 31 years was 4 days in the ground. His son was sitting at his dining room table with a hired attorney and a document challenging everything Walter had spent his last months of life building. And Ethan's explanation was that he just wanted to make sure everything was right. I picked up the document. I looked through it slowly, page by page, with a composure I want to be honest about. It was not natural. It was constructed. Beneath it, I was shaking with something that was equal parts grief and rage, 2 emotions that had been running parallel for days and were now, finally, merging into something I was struggling to keep contained. The document was a formal letter of intent to contest the corporate restructuring. It cited Walter's terminal diagnosis as grounds for questioning his competency. It requested access to financial records, internal communications, and the legal documentation around the transfer. It was thorough. It was professionally drafted. It had clearly been in preparation for longer than 4 days. She had the attorney on retainer before Walter died. The realization moved through me cold and absolute. She had hired Richard Hale before the funeral, before the hospice nurses came, maybe before December, maybe before November. She had been building this case while Walter was still alive, while I was measuring out medications and learning to talk to oncologists without crying, while my husband was spending the last of his energy trying to protect me. She had been building a case against a dying man. I set the document down. I smoothed the pages flat with my palm. I looked at Richard Hale. "Mr. Hale," I said, "I'd like you to leave my house." He blinked. Just once, but it was a genuine blink. He had not expected that to be the first thing out of my mouth. He had expected questions, maybe tears, maybe the particular overwhelmed silence of a widow who didn't know what she was looking at. "Mrs. Bennett, I understand this is difficult timing, but I think if you review the document—" "I've reviewed it," I said, "and I want you to leave my house." "Mom," Ethan started. "You're welcome to stay," I said, looking at my son. "You are always welcome here, but I want your attorney and his briefcase and that document off my dining room table in the next 5 minutes." Richard Hale looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely read. There was calculation in it, and behind the calculation something that might have been surprise, and behind the surprise, very briefly, something that might have been respect. She thought she had come here to deal with a grieving woman who would be too overwhelmed to push back. She was recalibrating. "Richard," she said quietly, "give us a minute." He picked up his briefcase and walked into the hallway. He did not go to the front door. He stood in the hallway, which I noticed, which told me he expected to be called back shortly. The three of us sat at the dining room table. I waited. Vivian tried first. Margaret, I know this feels aggressive. It's not meant to be. We genuinely want what's best for this family. What's best for this family? I repeated. Ethan is Walter's son. He has a stake in everything Walter built. That's not unreasonable. No, I said. It's not unreasonable at all. Walter knew that. That's why he set up a trust for Ethan. Ethan has a stake in this company. A protected one, structured specifically for him. What you're asking for is something different. Vivian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The trust was set up without Ethan's input. Walter didn't need Ethan's input. Walter built the company. Walter made the decisions about what to do with it. Walter was dying, she said. And the bluntness of it, the way she said it, flat and tactical, like she was placing a card on the table, made Ethan flinch visibly. Vivian, he said very quietly. She didn't look at him. Walter was dying, she said again to me. And people make decisions under those conditions that they might not make otherwise. We're not accusing anyone of wrongdoing. We're asking for transparency. You're asking for my company, I said. The room went completely still. I hadn't raised my voice. I want to be clear about that. Everything I said in that room, I said at the same level I might use to discuss the weather, because I had learned from 3 decades at Walter's side that volume is not authority. Authority is the thing underneath the volume, the thing that doesn't need to announce itself. You've been calling my employees for months, I said. You've been talking to my operations manager about new leadership. You had a litigation attorney on retainer before my husband's body was cold. Don't sit at my table and tell me you want transparency. Vivian's face went very still. Ethan turned to look at her. You talked to Dennis. She didn't answer him right away, which was its own answer. Ethan, she said, with the particular measured patience of someone who has managed this person before and knows exactly how to do it. I was trying to be proactive. I was trying to protect us. Dennis works for my mother, he said. His voice was low and uncertain, but it was there. Why would you call Dennis? Because someone had to. Because your father was sick and no one was talking about what happens next, and I was trying to make sure. Make sure what? I said. She looked at me. Make sure we weren't cut out, she said. And there it was. The real sentence, the one underneath all the talk about transparency and what's best for the family and proactive planning. We weren't cut out. She had never been in. She had been reaching for something that was never hers to begin with, and the fear that someone would notice and close the door had driven her to do things that she was right now trying to make sound reasonable. I stood up. I need you both to leave, I said. Not because I'm angry and not because I don't want Ethan in my life, but because I will not negotiate the terms of my husband's legacy at my dining room table 3 days after I buried him. If you have legal claims, Patricia Okafor is my attorney. You have her contact information through your attorney. Have Richard Hale call her. Vivian stood. She smoothed her jacket. She picked up her purse. She walked to the hallway and said something quiet to Richard Hale that I couldn't hear, and I heard the front door open. Ethan did not stand up immediately. He sat there at the table, looking at the place where the document had been, and his face was doing the thing it used to do when he was small and something had happened that he didn't know how to process. A kind of internal weather moving through him that he hadn't learned to hide well. Ethan, I said. Did Dad know? He asked. About Vivian calling the office? Yes. He closed his eyes briefly, opened them. He never said anything to me. What would he have said? He didn't have an answer for that. Go home, I said, and I kept my voice as gentle as I could manage because he was still my son. And the thing I had heard in that broken sound on the phone when I told him his father was gone, that sound did not belong to a man who had planned any of this. That sound belonged to a child who had just lost his father. Go home and think about what you actually want, Ethan, not what Vivian wants. What you want. And when you're ready to talk, just you and me, I'm here. He nodded. He stood up. He walked to the front door and I heard it close behind him, and then I heard the car on the gravel driveway, and then the sound faded and the house was quiet. I sat back down at the dining room table. I put my hands flat on the surface, on the same wood where Walter had laid his plans and folded his hands and told me the truth on a night that felt like a lifetime ago. I sat there, and I let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened, because I had been holding it back for the entire conversation and my body was done cooperating. My son had brought a lawyer to my house 3 days after his father's funeral. My son had sat across from me and let his wife speak for him. My son had looked at Vivian before he could answer a question from his own mother. I had known Ethan was weak in the way that some people are. Not cruel, not malicious, just insufficiently rooted, easily redirected by whoever was closest and loudest. I had known it, and I had felt guilty about knowing it, had told myself I was being unfair, had given him endless benefit of the doubt for years. But there is a difference between knowing something and watching it play out in front of you in the most painful possible context. And watching it that afternoon broke something in me that had been bending for a long time. I was not angry at him the way I was angry at Vivian. What I felt toward Ethan was something more complicated. A grief within a grief, a mourning for the son I had thought I was raising and the man I had hoped he would become. I had given him everything I had, and it had not been enough to keep him steady. And I did not know yet whether that was my failure or his, or simply the way some people are made. I sat at the table for a long time. Then I got up, walked to the bedroom closet, took the fireproof lockbox off the shelf, and opened it. The envelope was right where I had put it. Margaret. His terrible handwriting. I ran my thumb across the letters. I had promised myself I would know when it was time. This was the time. I carried the envelope to the dining room table, sat back down in the same chair, and opened it. Inside the envelope, there were 4 things. The first was a handwritten letter from Walter. 6 pages, both sides, in his cramped and slanted script that I had spent 31 years learning to read. I set it aside for last because I knew once I started reading it, I would not be able to stop, and I needed to understand the other 3 things first. The second was a contact card for an investigator named Carl Breen, with a note from Walter clipped to it. He's already working. Call him and he'll explain. The third was a printed document, a summary, Harold Kessler's letterhead, laying out the complete structure of the corporate transfer and the trust, with a cover note indicating that certified copies were filed with the state and that Harold held originals in escrow. The fourth was a single page of notes in Walter's handwriting. Not a letter, just notes, observations. Dated entries the way he used to keep project logs. The earliest entry was from 8 months ago. I read the notes first. March 4th. Vivian asked Ethan about the insurance policies. He mentioned it to me casually. I don't think he realized what he was telling me. She wanted to know the beneficiary structure. March 19th. V called the office directly asking about ownership percentages, Dennis told me. April 7th. I've started noticing she watches me differently. Not concern, assessment, like she's trying to decide something. April 28th. Went to the doctor alone. Results concerning. Did not tell Maggie yet. Told Harold to begin the restructuring work immediately. And then, about halfway down the page, an entry that made me stop breathing for a moment. May 15th. Spoke to Carl Breen. He has a contact at the medical clinic, a former colleague. He believes someone in the clinic may have given V access to my appointment records. Working to confirm. I read that entry 3 times. Vivian had known about Walter's illness because someone had told her. Not because she was clever or observant, not because she'd noticed some change in him. Someone with access to his medical records had passed information to her. Someone had violated my husband's privacy at the most vulnerable moment of his life. Someone had turned his diagnosis into an opportunity and handed it to her before he even had time to tell his own wife. My hands were shaking. I realized I had been holding the page so tightly that the edges were creasing. I put it down. I breathed. I picked up the contact card for Carl Breen. I called him at, I looked at the clock, 6:47 in the evening. He answered on the second ring. Mrs. Bennett, he said, I've been expecting your call. I'm very sorry about Walter. Thank you, I said. I'm looking at his notes, the entry from May 15th. Yes, Carl said. I've been working on that for the past 3 months. I have what I need to give you a full picture, but I wanted to wait until you were ready. I'm ready, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Are you sure? It's a lot, and you just... Carl, I said, tell me. A sec. What Carl Breen told me over the next 45 minutes restructured everything I thought I knew about the past year. Vivian had a connection, a woman named Teresa Falk, who worked as an administrative coordinator at the medical clinic, where Walter had his first appointments. Teresa Falk and Vivian had known each other for years through a professional network they'd both been part of in the city before Vivian married Ethan. They had maintained the friendship quietly, the way people maintain useful connections. Not close, but warm, a text here and a lunch there, the kind of relationship that doesn't draw attention. In March, around the time Walter first began noticing symptoms significant enough to warrant a visit, Teresa Falk had accessed his appointment records. Not the medical notes themselves, those were in a different system with tighter restrictions, but the scheduling records, the type of specialist appointments, the frequency of visits, the referral to oncology. You don't need someone's pathology report to understand what oncology referrals mean. Teresa had passed the information to Vivian. Carl could not yet prove the exact method, whether by text, phone, email, or conversation, but he had phone records showing contact between them in March, April, and May, each instance within days of Walter's clinic visits. The pattern was unmistakable. The contact in March was the first time, Carl said. She knew something was wrong before Walter had even gotten his diagnosis confirmed. That's why she started making calls to your employees in April. She already knew, and she was already planning. I sat at the dining room table in the quiet of the farmhouse that my husband was no longer in, and I absorbed this. Vivian had known before me. Walter had gotten his first specialist referral, and before he had even had time to tell his wife of 31 years, his daughter-in-law had been informed by a back channel and had begun making moves to position herself for what came next. The access to the scheduling records is a HIPAA violation, Carl said. A significant one. Teresa Falk violated federal privacy law, and Vivian, depending on how the contact can be characterized, may have facilitated it. Can it be proven? I asked. The phone records are already documented. I have statements from a former coworker of Teresa's who saw her accessing records she had no authorization to view. It's not airtight, but it's substantial, and with the right attorney it becomes a lot more than substantial. Patricia Okafor, I thought. Patricia, who was a litigation specialist. Walter knew all of this, I said. He knew the shape of it. He found out in May that someone had accessed his records. He hired me to identify who. By June, we had enough to know it was Teresa and that Vivian was the connection. He didn't have the full documentation you have now. I've continued working since then. Why didn't he... I stopped, reorganized the question. Why didn't he confront Ethan? Carl was quiet for a moment. He told me he wasn't sure it would help. He said confronting Ethan would cause a fight, and Vivian would manage Ethan through the fight, and in the end, Ethan would come out the other side more loyal to her and further from his parents. He said the only way to actually protect you was to make the legal structure so solid that it didn't matter what Ethan did or didn't do. That was Walter. That was completely, entirely Walter. Solving the problem 3 steps ahead rather than fighting the battle in front of him. I pressed my hand flat against the table. Walter let himself die knowing this woman had violated his privacy, I said. Knowing she knew before his own wife, and he built a wall around it and moved on. He built a wall around you, Carl said gently. I did not cry. I don't know why. I had been crying for days. I had cried until there was nothing left. And somehow, in that moment, with Carl Breen's voice on the phone and Walter's handwritten notes spread across the table, the grief had passed the point where tears could express it. What I felt was something deeper and quieter and harder than tears. Something that would take years to fully name. What do I do with this? I asked. That's your call, Carl said. You have grounds to report Teresa Falk to the clinic and to the relevant regulatory bodies. That's almost certainly going to end her career. You have grounds, through Patricia, to include Vivian's involvement in any legal defense against the estate contest. It becomes relevant to her credibility and to the argument that the contest itself was predatory rather than legitimate. And Richard Hale's document, the contest? That's for Patricia. But with what I have, plus Harold Kessler's testimony about Walter's competency, plus the documented pattern of Vivian's conduct, the contest is not going to go anywhere. I sat with that for a moment. Send me everything, I said. Every document, every record, everything you have. Send it to Patricia as well. I want her to have it before she hears from Richard Hale's office. Already prepared, Carl said. I can send it tonight. After I hung up, I finally read Walter's letter. All 6 pages. I will not recount everything he wrote, because some things between a husband and wife are not meant to become part of any larger story. But I will say this. He wrote about the day we bought the first truck, and how I had been the one to do the final negotiation because the seller kept talking over Walter, and I had finally had enough and just taken over. He wrote about the year we almost lost everything, and how I had been the one who kept the books organized well enough that we could prove to the bank we were worth saving. He wrote about watching me raise Ethan, and the things he regretted not saying to me about how much that cost me, the ways I had given myself to our son and our company and our life together until there was sometimes almost nothing left for the quieter kind of giving. And then, near the end, he wrote, "The envelope is not instructions, Maggie. You don't need instructions from me. You never did. It's just the information you need to fight with. The fighting. You'll do that exactly right without anyone telling you how." I held the letter for a long time. Outside, the winter dark had settled over the farmhouse completely. The land Walter had spent 30 years looking at from the kitchen window was invisible in the darkness, and the house was the quietest it had ever been. And somewhere in the city, 40 miles away, Richard Hale was probably drafting a follow-up letter to Patricia Okafor, and Vivian was probably in her living room calculating next moves, and none of them, not a single one of them, had any idea what Walter had built or how completely it was about to close around them. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope with the other documents. I put the envelope in the lockbox. I put the lockbox back on the shelf. Then I went to the kitchen, made myself a cup of tea, and sat at the same counter where Walter had stood on that October night with his keys in his hand and the truth he couldn't yet say written all over his face. I drank the tea. I thought about Teresa Falk, who had looked at my husband's appointment records and made a phone call. I thought about Vivian, who had received that call and started planning before I knew there was anything to plan for. I thought about Ethan, sitting at my dining room table looking at his wife before he could answer a question from his own mother. And I thought about Patricia Okafor, who was a litigation specialist, and Carl Breen, who had 3 months of documentation, and Harold Kessler, who had a 40-year career and a sworn statement about exactly how clear-headed my husband had been. I finished my tea, I rinsed the cup, and then I picked up my phone and I called Patricia Okafor. And when she answered, I said, "I opened the envelope. I need to tell you everything." Patricia Okafor did not sleep that night either. I know this because she sent me emails at 2 in the morning and again at 4:15, each one with attached notes, follow-up questions, and a list of steps she was already preparing. By the time I woke up the next morning, if what I had done could be called sleeping, which was generous, she had already drafted a formal response to Richard Hale's letter of intent and had begun preparing what she called a defensive disclosure package, which was her term for the organized presentation of everything Carl Breen had documented. She called me at 7:30. "I read everything Carl sent," she said, skipping any preamble, which I had come to understand was simply how Patricia operated when she was focused. "The HIPAA violation is real, and it's serious. Teresa Falk accessed records she had no authorization to view. That is a federal offense, and it is documentable. The phone contact between her and Vivian in the days immediately following each clinic visit, that pattern is not coincidence, and any judge with functioning eyes is going to see that." "What does it mean for the estate contest?" I asked. "It means the contest is built on a foundation that is about to collapse," Patricia said. "Richard Hale filed that letter of intent assuming he was dealing with a grieving widow who had no preparation and no documentation. He does not yet know what we have. When he finds out, he is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with his clients." "When do we tell him?" "We don't tell him. We show him. I'm going to respond to his letter today. I'm going to be professional and measured, and I am going to include enough of what we have that he understands his clients have a serious problem. I want to give him the opportunity to withdraw gracefully before this becomes something that follows Vivian publicly." I thought about that. You're giving her a way out. I'm giving Richard Hale a way out, Patricia corrected. He's an attorney. He has an ethical obligation not to pursue a claim he knows to be without merit, and once I show him what we have, he will know. What Vivian does after that is up to Vivian. I poured my coffee and stood at the kitchen counter, Walter's counter, where he had stood on that October night that felt like it belonged to a different life, and I looked out the window at the land in the gray morning light. Patricia, I said, what happens to Teresa Falk? There was a brief pause. That depends on what you want to do. You can report her to the clinic directly, to the relevant state health board, and to the Department of Health and Human Services, which handles federal HIPAA violations. The clinic would almost certainly terminate her. The federal complaint could result in significant fines and sanctions. Her career in medical administration would be effectively over. And if I don't report? Then she faces no consequences. And the next family she does this to has no warning. I already knew the answer. I think I had known it since the night before, when I'd read Walter's notes and understood fully what had been done. Not just to our company, not just to our financial future, but to the private, sacred space of a man's last months. Walter had sat in a doctor's office alone and received news that would end his life. And before he could decide how to carry that news home to me, someone had taken it and turned it into a transaction. That was not something I could let pass for the sake of keeping things uncomplicated. Report her, I said. All three. I'll prepare the filings this week, Patricia said. Now, I need you to do something for me today, and it's going to be difficult. What? I need you to write down everything you remember about Vivian's behavior over the past year. Not legal language, not formal, just your observations, your conversations, your impressions. The kitchen conversation in December, the hallway conversation, the same visit, the dining room confrontation after the funeral, everything. The detail that feels too small to matter is often the detail that matters most. So I spent that morning at the dining room table writing, not in the grief-addled half-presence I'd been operating in for days, but with the focused, methodical attention I used to bring to the company accounts. Deliberate, thorough, trying to reconstruct not just what was said, but how it was said, what expression accompanied it, what the silences meant. I wrote for 3 hours and produced 14 pages, and when I sent them to Patricia, she responded within the hour. This is excellent. You observe people the way a good attorney does. I thought about what Walter had said in his letter, that I had never needed instructions from him, that the fighting I would do exactly right. I hoped he was correct. I was less certain than he was. Richard Hale's response to Patricia's letter came 4 days later. In the intervening days, the shape of normal life had begun reasserting itself in small, insistent ways. Dennis called about a contract renewal that needed my signature. 2 of our drivers sent condolence cards that arrived in the same mail as the electric bill. The farmhouse, which had been full of people in the immediate aftermath of the funeral, was now quiet in the sustained way of a place that has returned to its ordinary rhythms without the person who set those rhythms. I went into the office on the 3rd day. I had not planned to. I had thought I would need more time, that walking into the building Walter had built would undo me in some way I wasn't prepared for. But Dennis had called about a vendor dispute that had been simmering for 2 weeks and genuinely needed someone with authority to resolve it. And I found myself thinking that sitting in the farmhouse was not doing me any good, that the grief was going to be everywhere I went, and I might as well be somewhere useful while I carried it. I sat in Walter's chair. It was strange. The chair fit me wrong. Walter was broader across the shoulders than I was, and the armrests were set for his proportions, and I sat there feeling the wrongness of it in a physical way that was unexpectedly hard. But I stayed. I reviewed the vendor dispute. I made the call. I signed the contract renewal Dennis had ready, and I walked the floor and spoke to 3 of the drivers who had known Walter for years and were quietly worried about what his absence meant for their jobs. And I told them the truth. Nothing was changing. We were not being sold. They were valued, and their positions were secure. By the time I drove home that evening, something had shifted in me in a direction I couldn't fully name. Not better, exactly. Not healed. But functional in a way that felt like it belonged to me, not just to the emergency of the situation. The call from Patricia came the next morning. Richard Hale withdrew the letter of intent, she said. I sat down on the kitchen chair hard. He withdrew it? Called me yesterday afternoon, professional, brief, gave me the standard language about clients reassessing their position. He knows what we have and he knows what it means for his case. I could hear in her voice the particular satisfaction of a litigator who has correctly predicted an opponent's move. He's not going to pursue this, Margaret. The contest is over. I pressed my hand flat on the kitchen table. The same table. Always the same table. Did he say anything about Vivian? Not directly, but reading between the lines, I think she pushed for him to hold the position and he refused. He's an attorney with a reputation to maintain. Once I showed him the HIPAA documentation and Carl's records, continuing would have required him to argue in court that Walter's estate restructuring was invalid, while simultaneously the evidence showed his client had been receiving illegally obtained information about Walter's medical status. He's not going to do that. What does Vivian do now? She has no legal standing without an attorney willing to file. She could try to find another one, but Richard Hale is not going to give her a positive referral, and any competent attorney who reviews the evidence is going to reach the same conclusion he did. Patricia paused. She's not done necessarily. People like Vivian don't generally accept defeat quietly, but legally she has no ground to stand on. I thought about Vivian in my dining room. The measured way she spoke, the careful calibration of every word and expression, the smile that didn't reach her eyes. She had built a very sophisticated operation around a very simple objective. Take what someone else built because she decided she was entitled to it. And she had done it with enough patience and subtlety that for months I had second-guessed my own instincts about her. "What about Ethan?" I asked. The question came out differently than I intended. Quieter, carrying more weight than the legal question I had meant to ask. Patricia heard the weight. Legally, Ethan's position is unchanged. The trust Walter set up for him is solid. It provides for him without giving anyone else a handle on it. He has what Walter intended for him to have. She paused again. The rest is between you and your son. The Teresa Falk situation moved faster than I expected. Carl Breen's documentation was thorough enough that the medical clinic began its own internal investigation within 2 weeks of receiving the complaint. I was not kept formally informed of their process. That was internal HR territory. But Carl had contacts, and he told me enough. Teresa Falk had been placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, and a second employee had come forward during the review with observations that corroborated the unauthorized access. The federal HIPAA complaint took longer, as federal processes do, but Patricia had filed it correctly and completely, and it was moving through the appropriate channels with the inexorable slowness of regulatory machinery that, once engaged, does not easily stop. I did not take any pleasure in Teresa Falk's professional destruction. I want to be honest about that, because I think it would be easy to tell this story as a victory narrative. The bad people punished, the good people vindicated, everything resolved with the clean satisfaction of a moral scale that balances perfectly. That was not how it felt. What I felt mostly was tired. I felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been in a sustained state of alertness for months, watching, documenting, preparing, bracing, and who has now been told the acute emergency is over but cannot immediately locate the off switch for all that readiness. I slept badly for weeks after Richard Hale withdrew the letter. I woke at 3 a.m. convinced I had forgotten something critical, some document that wasn't filed, some move I hadn't anticipated. I would lie in the dark in the farmhouse bedroom, and the silence would press down on me, and I would reach, in the half-conscious way you reach for something in the dark, for Walter's breathing beside me. He wasn't there. He was never going to be there. The legal situation had resolved, and I was still a woman whose husband was gone, and those two facts occupied completely separate spaces in my chest and did not comfort each other. I went to the office more. Dennis became accustomed to me appearing without prior notice, which I think he found both reassuring and occasionally alarming. I sat in on operational meetings I had never attended before, not because I was trying to micromanage, but because I was learning, really learning, at a depth I hadn't needed before, exactly how the company worked. Walter had always been the one with the deep operational knowledge. I had the financial architecture in my head, the accounts and the contracts and the billing structures, but the daily mechanics of running a fleet, The routing decisions, the maintenance schedules, the intricate human ecology of managing drivers who spent weeks on the road and came back with the particular combination of exhaustion and restlessness that long-haul work produces. That had been Walter's territory. It needed to become mine. Dennis was patient with my learning curve in a way that I found quietly moving. He explained things without condescension, answered questions I suspect he considered basic without making me feel basic for asking them, and occasionally told me what Walter would have done in situations where I was uncertain, not to suggest I should do the same, but as a reference point that I found genuinely useful. He would have called the regional manager himself, Dennis told me once, about a distribution dispute with one of our larger clients. He didn't like letting these things sit, said problems are cheaper when they're small. He said that to me about everything, I told Dennis. Truck problems, money problems, Ethan problems. Dennis almost smiled. Did it work? Usually, I said. Not always. I called the regional manager myself that afternoon. Mech. Vivian's silence lasted 6 weeks. I had been waiting for it to break, not because I was afraid of what she would do next, but because I had learned enough about her by then to know that silence from Vivian was not acceptance. It was preparation. She was not the kind of person who absorbed a defeat and adjusted her expectations. She was the kind of person who looked for a different angle. The different angle turned out to be Ethan. He came to the farmhouse alone on a Sunday afternoon in early March. No Vivian, no attorney, just my son in his car with a paper bag containing the kind of pastries from the bakery in town that I had been buying since he was a child, the ones with the lemon filling that he had never outgrown. He rang the doorbell instead of letting himself in, which told me he wasn't sure of his welcome, which meant he still had enough self-awareness to understand that he had not handled himself well. I let him in. I made coffee. I put the pastries on a plate. We sat at the kitchen table. He did not say anything for a long moment, just wrapped his hands around the coffee mug and looked at the table in the way he had always looked at things he was trying to figure out how to say. I've been thinking, he finally said. Okay, I said. I didn't know she called Dennis. Before everything. I didn't know she was doing that. I believe you, I said. I meant it. But I knew... He stopped. Tried again. I knew something was happening. I could tell she was thinking about the company a lot, asking questions about it. And I told myself she was just being practical, that she was worried about the future and doing what Vivian does when she's worried, which is plan. He looked up from the table. I told myself a lot of things. What things? That she had a right to be involved. That if something happened to Dad, we should have a say. He pressed his lips together. I knew those weren't really right, but they were easier than the alternative. Which was? Telling her to stop. I looked at my son. He looked like his father around the eyes, and he had my mother's tendency to hold tension in his jaw. And right now, he looked like a man who had been carrying something heavy in a direction that wasn't working and had finally turned around. Why didn't you? I asked. Not accusingly. Genuinely. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I started to think he wasn't going to answer. Because the last time I pushed back against something Vivian felt strongly about, he said slowly, she didn't speak to me for 4 days. And then she told me that I didn't trust her judgment, and I was treating her like she wasn't a full partner, and she cried, and I spent 2 weeks feeling like I'd done something terrible. He looked at the table. And I thought about how much easier it was to just let her handle things. She's very good at handling things. She is, I agreed. She handled me, he said, and the flatness of it, the way he said it with the particular self-disgust of someone who has only recently understood something they should have seen years earlier, made something loosen in my chest a little. Ethan, I said, your father knew this about you. The way you get caught between what you know is right and what feels easier. He knew it, and he worried about it, and he loved you anyway. I paused. He also made sure that your weakness couldn't be used to take from you what he wanted you to have. Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't want the trust. What do you mean? I mean, I don't want something that was set up to protect me from my own wife. He stopped. That's not how it should be. No, I agreed. It's not how it should be. He looked at me. Is what she did illegal? The things Carl found, the stuff with the clinic? Her involvement is being reviewed, I said carefully. I'm not going to tell you what's happening legally because I don't think that conversation belongs between us right now. If you want to know, you need to talk to your own attorney, not Vivian's. He understood what I was saying. I watched him understand it. She's going to be angry when she finds out I came here, he said. Probably, I said. She's going to say I'm undermining her. Probably. He looked at me for a long moment. What would you do? If you were me? It was the most direct question he had asked me in years, maybe the most direct question he had ever asked me. I thought about it honestly because he deserved honest and not diplomatic. I think you need to decide what kind of man you are when someone isn't managing you, I said. Because Vivian has been managing you for 4 years and your father managed you before that, in a gentler way. And I managed you before him, and you are 52 years old, and I don't think you actually know yet what you want when no one is telling you. I kept my voice even. I'm not saying that to be cruel. I'm saying it because it's true, and because you're smart enough to handle hearing it. He was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to be different than I am, he said finally. That's the most honest thing you've said to me in 4 years, I told him. Start there. We finished the coffee. We ate the pastries with the lemon filling. We talked haltingly about things that didn't involve Vivian or attorneys or corporate structures, about a memory he had of fishing with Walter when he was 12, about a trip we had taken when Ethan was in high school that had gone comically wrong in ways that had become family mythology. Small things, old things. The kind of conversation that doesn't rebuild anything by itself, but marks the location of the foundation so you know where to begin. When he left, he hugged me at the door. Properly, not the stiff formal hug of the December visits when Vivian was watching, but the longer, less self-conscious version he had given me for most of his childhood. I'm going to figure it out, he said. Not to me exactly, more to himself. I know, I said, and I mostly meant it. What I did not tell Ethan that afternoon, because it was not information he needed yet, and because I was still processing it myself, was what Patricia had told me the previous Thursday. The clinic's internal investigation had concluded. Teresa Falk had been terminated. The findings of the investigation had been forwarded to the relevant authorities as required, which meant the federal process was now additionally supported by the clinic's own documented conclusions. And Teresa Falk, faced with termination and a federal complaint and the loss of everything she had built in 20 years of medical administration, had decided to cooperate. She had given a formal statement. In it, she confirmed that she had accessed Walter's scheduling records without authorization. She confirmed that she had passed the information to Vivian, and she confirmed something that neither Carl nor Patricia had known before, that Vivian had not simply received the information. Vivian had asked for it. Specifically and deliberately, Vivian had called Teresa in March and said she was worried about her father-in-law's health and asked if Teresa could look at his recent appointment history and tell her if there was anything concerning. She had framed it as a family concern. Teresa had told herself it was a family concern. She had told herself this, as people tell themselves things that let them do what they want to do, all the way up to the moment it stopped being possible to pretend. Vivian had solicited the HIPAA violation. She had not just received stolen information, she had commissioned it. She had used a friendship to reach into my husband's medical privacy and extract exactly what she needed to begin her positioning before he could protect himself. When Patricia told me this, I sat in her office with my hands folded in my lap and my face arranged in the same composure I had used in the dining room on the afternoon of Richard Hale's visit, and I waited until I was sure my voice would be level before I spoke. What does this mean for Vivian's exposure? I asked. Soliciting a HIPAA violation carries its own liability, Patricia said. This is no longer just Vivian benefiting incidentally from someone else's bad act. She initiated it. That changes the picture significantly. What are our options? Patricia looked at me carefully. She had a way of looking at me that took a moment before answering. Not hesitation, but assessment, making sure she was reading the room correctly. You can pursue a civil action against Vivian directly. Invasion of privacy, intentional interference with inheritance expectancy, potentially others depending on how the evidence develops. It would be costly, time-consuming, and it would become public. Or the regulatory findings against Teresa Falk include Vivian's name as the soliciting party. That becomes part of the official record without a separate civil action. It doesn't result in a judgment against Vivian, but it is a permanent documented finding that she caused a federal privacy violation to be committed against her own father-in-law. I thought about Ethan sitting at my kitchen table with his lemon pastry and his careful, halting honesty. I thought about what a civil action would mean for him, for the marriage he was already clearly in the process of reconsidering, or at least of examining with newly honest eyes. A lawsuit with his mother suing his wife would not make that process easier. I thought about Walter, who had chosen to build a wall rather than fight a battle. The regulatory record, I said. That's enough. Patricia nodded slowly. Are you sure? I'm sure that I'm not doing this for punishment, I said. I'm doing it because she needs to be accountable. A permanent finding in a federal record is accountability. A lawsuit is a war, and I'm tired. I looked at my hands. Walter spent his last months building the wall. I don't need to spend my first year without him burning everything down. I just need it on record that she did this. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's a wise decision, she said, and then in a softer register that I hadn't heard from her before. Walter would agree with it, I think. I didn't know whether that was true. Walter might have wanted the lawsuit. He had a certain intolerance for people who did harmful things and faced no formal consequence for them. But I also knew that Walter had chosen strategy over confrontation at every major decision point of the past year, had chosen building over burning, had chosen protecting over fighting, and in the end, what he had left me was not a battlefield, but a foundation. I was going to keep building on it. The regulatory process moved forward. Vivian's name appeared in the official findings as the party who had solicited the unauthorized access. The document was not front-page news, it was bureaucratic language in a federal filing, but it was real, and it was permanent, and it could not be undone. Richard Hale called Patricia 1 week later, not about the estate contest, which was settled, about the finding. His clients are distressed, Patricia told me, with the careful neutrality of someone who was not going to editorialize out loud about how she felt about that. I imagine they are, I said. He wanted to know if there was any avenue for, his word, reconciliation. I thought about the dining room table. I thought about Vivian's smile that didn't reach her eyes. I thought about the phrase new leadership delivered to Dennis over the phone while Walter was still alive. Tell him reconciliation is a conversation I'm prepared to have with my son, I said. It's not a conversation I'm prepared to have with his client. Patricia conveyed that message. Richard Hale did not call again. And then, about 2 weeks after that, on a Tuesday morning when I was sitting in what had become my office at Bennett Transportation, I had moved my things in, rearranged the desk so it fit the way I used it rather than the way Walter had. Dennis knocked on the open door. There's something you should see, he said. He handed me a printout, a logistics industry newsletter, a small item in the regional business section, nothing dramatic. But the company name in it made me read it twice and then a third time. A regional competitor, one who had been quietly expanding their fleet over the past 2 years, had put out a public statement of interest in acquiring transportation businesses in our area. The company's listed strategic advisor was a consultancy I did not recognize. Carl Breen, when I called him that afternoon, recognized it immediately. That consultancy, he said carefully, was registered in this state 14 months ago. The registered agent is a holding company. The holding company's listed contact is a woman named Vivian Bennett. The silence on my end was long enough that Carl said, "Margaret, you there?" "I'm here," I said. Vivian had not accepted defeat. She had simply moved the pieces to a different board. Unable to take Bennett Transportation from the inside, she had positioned herself on the outside, setting up a consultancy, cultivating a relationship with a competitor, and now that competitor was publicly signaling acquisition interest in companies exactly like ours. She was going to try to buy us, or help someone else buy us, or force a position where refusing the acquisition looked unreasonable and accepting it gave her exactly the foothold she had been reaching for from the beginning. I sat in the office that Walter built, and I looked at the printout, and I felt something move through me. Not panic, not grief, something colder and cleaner than either of those. 14 months ago. She had registered that consultancy 14 months ago. 7 months before Walter's diagnosis, before she even had his medical records. This had never been about the diagnosis. The diagnosis had been an opportunity she recognized because she had already been watching for one. Vivian had decided she wanted this company before Walter was sick. The illness had simply accelerated her timeline. I put the printout face down on my desk. I thought about Walter standing at the kitchen window on an October evening with his keys in his hand and the truth he couldn't yet say. I thought about the envelope. You'll know. I picked up my phone and I called Patricia Okafor. We have a new development, I said, and I need you to think about something Walter said to me once, that problems are cheaper when they're small. Patricia's response to the news about Vivian's consultancy was not what I expected. I had anticipated urgency, a rapid pivot to legal strategy, another round of documentation requests, the particular focused energy she brought to problems that required immediate action. Instead, she was quiet on the phone for a long moment after I told her what Carl had found, and when she spoke, her voice had a different quality than I was used to from her. "How are you, Margaret?" she asked. "Not legally, actually." The question caught me off guard enough that I didn't have a prepared answer ready, which meant the honest one came out instead. "I'm tired," I said. "I'm tired in a way I don't have a word for. My husband has been gone for 2 months, and I have spent most of those 2 months in a legal situation that required me to be functional when I mostly wanted to sit on the floor of the farmhouse and not speak to anyone." "That's what I thought," she said. "So before we talk about Vivian's consultancy, I want to tell you something, and I need you to actually hear it. Okay? You are not in immediate danger," she said. "The acquisition interest in the newsletter is public positioning. It's Vivian signaling to the market, not an action. A competitor expressing acquisition interest does not obligate you to anything. You have sole voting control of this company. No one can force you to sell, to negotiate, to engage at any level you're not willing to engage at. What she has done is set up a structure that could become a problem. It is not yet a problem." I let that settle. "She's patient," I said. "She is, but patience works both ways. You have time to respond to this correctly instead of reactively, and that matters." Patricia paused. "The right response to this is not another legal filing. The right response is to make Bennett Transportation so obviously healthy, so clearly led, so visibly stable that the acquisition argument that you need a buyer because the company is adrift without Walter has no surface to attach to." It was such a simple thing to say. Such an obvious thing, in retrospect. And yet sitting in that office 2 months after Walter's death, running on inadequate sleep and residual adrenaline and grief that had been on hold for weeks, I had been reading that newsletter printout like it was another legal emergency when it was actually something else entirely. It was an invitation to doubt myself, and I had almost accepted it. "You're right," I said. "I know," Patricia said, with the unsentimental directness that I had come to rely on the way you rely on a level when you're trying to hang something straight. "Now, here is what I'm actually going to do about the consultancy. I'm going to have Carl document the connection between Vivian and the acquisition interest and add it to the file. If this ever becomes a formal legal situation, we have the paper trail. But I'm not going to fire a legal shot at a target that hasn't moved yet, because that is expensive and exhausting, and you just told me you're tired." "I appreciate that," I said. "Go home," she said. "It's Tuesday. Go home and eat something that isn't coffee." I went home. I ate something that wasn't coffee, and then I did something I had not done in 2 months, which was sit in the living room in the evening without a legal pad or a phone or a task requiring completion, and I let the farmhouse be quiet around me, and I thought about what Patricia had said. Make the company so obviously healthy that the acquisition argument has no surface to attach to. That was the fight, not the courtrooms, not the filings, not the careful escalation of documented evidence. All of that had been necessary, and I did not regret a moment of it. But the real fight, the one that would actually determine what happened to everything Walter and I had built, was the one happening in the office every day. It was the contract renewals and the fleet decisions and the operational choices that would either keep Bennett Transportation standing or allow doubt to erode it from the inside. Walter had spent his last months building the legal wall. Now I had to build the company to stand behind it. Yeah, I want to tell you what that looked like because I think the part of this story that tends to get left out is the part that isn't dramatic. The legal battle had a shape, a beginning, a series of escalating moments, a resolution. It had antagonists who behaved badly and a protagonist who had to decide how to respond, and it had an outcome that could be summarized. The work of building a company is not like that. It does not escalate and resolve. It is daily and specific and often tedious, and it asks things of you that have nothing to do with courage or strategy and everything to do with showing up when you don't feel like it and making one reasonable decision after another until the decisions accumulate into something. I had been doing this alongside Walter for 30 years without fully understanding how much of the weight I was already carrying. When he was gone and the weight was entirely mine, I understood. Not in a way that made me feel proud, in a way that made me feel the specific grief of a partnership that had been so well balanced, I had sometimes failed to notice what he was giving me just by being there. Dennis and I developed a working rhythm over the first few months that I think surprised us both. He was a logistics thinker, practical, sequential, oriented around what needed to happen by when. And I was a financial thinker, oriented around what things cost and what they produced and whether the ratio made sense. Those two orientations fit together in the way that good working relationships fit together, not seamlessly but productively, each of us catching things the other one missed. In April, I sat down with Dennis and laid out a proposal I had been developing for 3 weeks. We had 41 active vehicles. Our regional routes were profitable but narrow. We had been cautious about expansion because expansion requires capital, and capital requires confidence in the future, and Walter had been, in his final year, conserving rather than growing. The time for conserving was over. I want to add 8 vehicles by the end of the year, I told Dennis. Not all at once. Phased. 2 in the second quarter, 3 in the third, 3 in the fourth, each one tied to a specific new contract before we acquire the vehicle. Dennis looked at the numbers I had laid out. You've been working on this a while. Since January, I said. Walter and I had talked about expanding in the fall before everything happened. The contracts are there. I've been talking to 2 regional distributors who are looking for reliable carriers. The question was whether the timing was right. Is the timing right? The timing is as right as it's going to be, I said, which is not the same as perfect, but I'm done waiting for perfect. Dennis studied the proposal for a long moment. He had a way of reviewing documents that reminded me of Walter, unhurried, working through it section by section, not reacting until he'd seen the whole thing. I can support this, he said finally. I'm going to want to talk through the routing implications on the third quarter edition specifically. But overall, yes, I think Walter would have moved on this. I know he would have, I said. That's partly why I'm doing it now instead of later. We moved on it. The 2 second quarter vehicles came online in May. Both were tied to a distribution contract with a regional grocery cooperative that had been in negotiation for 6 weeks. I had handled most of it myself, which felt like learning to drive on a highway instead of a parking lot. But Patricia had reviewed the contract terms and Harold had blessed the business structure, and we signed on a Thursday afternoon with 2 people who looked at me across the table without any of the subtle hesitation I had sometimes felt from people who expected to find Walter and found me instead. Or maybe they had that hesitation, and I no longer cared about it in the way I once might have. That was possible too. By June, Bennett Transportation had 43 active vehicles and 2 new client relationships, and a routing efficiency that Dennis had improved by renegotiating the maintenance schedule on a cluster of our older trucks. None of this was dramatic. None of it would have made the logistics industry newsletter. But it was real, and it was ours. And every day it was a little more obviously, visibly, undeniably ours. Ethan came back in May, not for a crisis, just to come. He called first, which he hadn't done in years, and asked if he could come for dinner on Saturday. I said yes. I made the roast chicken he had grown up eating, the one with the lemon and the garlic that Walter had always said smelled like the best version of home, and I set 2 places at the kitchen table because we were not a dining room occasion, the 2 of us alone. He came without Vivian. I did not ask about this directly. I noticed it, and I let him tell me what he wanted to tell me in the time and way he chose to tell it. It took until after dinner, when we were sitting with coffee and the kind of comfortable quiet that only exists between people who have a long history together, before he said, quietly, "We're separated." I looked at my coffee cup. "When?" I asked. "About 6 weeks ago. I moved out." He turned the mug in his hands. It wasn't one thing. It was a lot of things over a long time that I kept telling myself were normal, and then at some point I couldn't tell myself that anymore. "Are you okay?" He thought about it honestly, which was something I had noticed him doing more in the past few months, taking the question seriously instead of reflexively answering fine. "Some days," he said, "some days I'm really not. I'm in an apartment that doesn't feel like anything yet, and I'm 52 years old and I'm figuring out things about myself I should have figured out at 30. And that's—" He stopped. "It's humbling. That's the right word." "Humbling is okay," I said. "Humbling means you're paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. "I keep thinking about what you said in March, about not knowing what I want when no one's telling me." "I remember. I've been trying to figure it out. It's harder than it sounds." "I know," I said. "Your father spent 31 years knowing what he wanted and going after it, and it looked easy from the outside, but I watched him from the inside, and I can tell you it was not easy. He just did it anyway." Ethan nodded slowly. "He never told me that." "No," I said. "He thought he was protecting you from his self-doubt. He didn't want you to see him uncertain." I paused. "In retrospect, I think it would have helped you to see it. That's one of the things I wish we had done differently." He looked at me. "You're telling me this was partly your fault?" "I'm telling you that parents make choices, and some of them are wrong, and it doesn't mean they didn't love you. Your father sheltered you from uncertainty because he wanted you to feel safe, and it accidentally taught you that uncertainty was something you couldn't handle. That's on both of us." I held his gaze. "But you're the one who has to handle it now. We can own our part, and you still have to do the work." He was quiet for a long time. "The trust," he said finally. "Dad's trust. I want to use it to do something. That's what it's for. I want to go back to school." He said it quickly, like he'd been holding it and needed to release it before he could think better of it. "I know that sounds— I'm 52, but there's a program, a supply chain management certification, and Dennis mentioned once that the company might need someone to handle logistics development as you expand, and I thought—" He stopped himself. "I don't want you to give me a job because I'm your son. I want to earn it. I want to know enough to actually be useful." I looked at my son. He was not looking for permission. He was not looking at the door the way he used to look at Vivian before he could answer a question. He was looking at me with the specific anxious hope of someone who has decided what they want for possibly the first time in a long time and is terrified it won't be received well. "The certification takes 14 months, he said. "I already looked it up." "I know the program," I said. "Walter looked at it 2 years ago when he was thinking about expanding the logistics side. He thought it was solid." Ethan blinked. "He knew about it?" "He did a lot of research about the future of this company," I said. "Some of it ended up in an envelope. Some of it just lived in his head." I reached across the table and put my hand over his for a moment. Brief, not prolonged, because we were not a family that performed emotion, and I wasn't going to start now. "Enroll," I said, "and when you're done, come talk to me. I'm not promising you anything except that I'll look at what you know and what you can do and give it an honest evaluation." "That's all I want," he said. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm saying yes." The competitor with the acquisition interest, the company Vivian had been advising, made a formal approach in July. Not to me directly. They contacted Harold Kessler's office, which was the correct procedure, and Harold called me the same afternoon. "They've put a number on it," he said. He told me the number. It was a real number, a serious number, the kind of number that is designed to make a person pause and consider, and I will be honest with you, I paused. I considered. I sat in my office and looked at the fleet expansion projections Dennis and I had been building, and I thought about what that number represented in terms of the years Walter and I had spent. Then I thought about standing at this desk, about the grocery cooperative contract signed in May, about Ethan enrolled in a 14-month program, about Dennis in the next office with a routing plan for our 47th vehicle, about the maintenance schedule and the client relationships and the operational knowledge that had been Walter's and was now becoming mine. I thought about Vivian, whose name appeared nowhere in the formal approach, but whose fingerprints were all over its timing and its structure, who had spent 14 months building a vehicle to reach the same destination she'd been trying to reach since before my husband was sick. I called Harold back in 20 minutes. "Tell them no," I said. Harold was quiet for a beat. "No qualifications? No counteroffer?" "No," I said. "Just no. We're not for sale." Harold sounded like a man trying not to smile. "I'll communicate that." "Harold," I said, "thank you for everything you did for Walter, for everything you've done for me." "Don't thank me," he said. "Walter thanked me adequately. Just keep running the company well. That's the thanks I want." I kept running the company well. Carl Breen called me in August with the last piece of information I was going to receive from him for a while. Vivian and Ethan's divorce had been filed. The proceedings were going to be complicated. They had intertwined finances, and the consultancy question would create its own legal territory. But Ethan had retained his own attorney, someone who had no connection to Vivian's world, and Carl said that what he was hearing from his contacts suggested Ethan was navigating it with more spine than anyone had expected. I was glad to hear it. I was also clear-eyed enough to know that Ethan finding his spine in a divorce proceeding did not undo 4 years of choices, and that whatever version of my son emerged from the other side of this was going to be someone I would need to build a relationship with from something closer to scratch than I would have liked. We were not going to simply return to what we had been before Vivian. Too much had happened. Too much had been said and not said. Too much had been understood too late. But we were in contact. We were talking. He called on Sunday evenings, which was an old habit I had thought was gone forever, and we talked about things that mattered and things that didn't. And sometimes he asked me questions about the company that told me he was paying attention to what he was learning. And sometimes I asked him questions about his life that he answered with an honesty I found quietly remarkable given how much practice he'd had at not being honest. It was not healed. It was healing, which is a different thing, and a slower one, with setbacks and awkward silences and moments where I looked at my son and could not fully separate the man he was now from the man who had sat at my dining room table with a hired attorney 3 days after his father's funeral. I was working on that. I suspect I will be working on it for a long time. In September, 8 months after Walter died, I drove out to the far edge of the property on a Saturday morning. There's a place out there where the land rises slightly, and you can see the full length of the lower fields, and, on a clear day, the highway in the distance where our trucks run. Walter used to walk out there on weekend mornings when something was weighing on him. I had always known he went there, but I had never followed him, because some people need their space to think, and Walter was one of them, and I had learned to respect that. I walked out there with my coffee, and I stood in the September air, and I looked at the highway. 2 of our trucks passed while I was standing there. I recognized them by the fleet markings. We had updated the livery in July, a small change Dennis and I had decided on together, modernizing the logo slightly while keeping the color scheme Walter had chosen 20 years ago. The trucks looked good. They looked like what they were, part of a fleet that was operating and growing and not for sale. I stood there for a long time. I thought about what the past 8 months had required of me. Not just the legal maneuvering, not just the strategic responses to Vivian's various approaches, but the smaller things. Learning to sleep in the middle of the bed instead of on my side. Learning to make coffee for one. Learning to sit at the dining room table with papers spread out and no one across from me to say, "What are you working on, Maggie?" And the distracted way Walter said it when he was thinking about something else and just wanted to hear my voice. Learning that I was capable of carrying things I had assumed required 2 people to carry. That last one was the hardest lesson and the most important one, Not because it proved I was strong. I already knew I was strong, in the way that most people who have built something from nothing already know they are strong. It was hard because accepting it meant accepting that Walter was really gone, that this wasn't a temporary situation I was managing until he came back, that the company, the farmhouse, the land, the Sunday evening phone calls with Ethan, the relationship with Dennis and Harold and Patricia, all of it was now mine to carry on my own terms, not as an extension of a partnership, but as its own thing. That took longer to accept than any legal document or strategic decision. Some mornings, I was still accepting it. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, if that's all right. Not as Margaret Bennett, not inside the story, but as someone who has been thinking about what this experience means and who wants to say something about it that the narrative alone can't quite carry. There is a thing that happens to people who build something slowly, over decades, with their hands and their judgment and their willingness to sacrifice. They begin to assume that the thing they built is safe simply because they built it. They trust the people around them the way you trust the house you live in, not because you've recently inspected the foundation, but because you've been standing in it a long time and it hasn't fallen yet. I made that mistake. I trusted the shape of my family without looking at what was inside it. What Vivian taught me, and I use that word deliberately, because even the people who harm us teach us something if we pay attention, was that proximity is not the same as loyalty. That someone can sit at your table, eat your food, smile in your direction for years, and be building an entirely different structure than the one you thought you were all constructing together. That the people most likely to reach for what you've built are the ones already inside the door. And what Walter taught me, what he had in fact been teaching me for 31 years without ever calling it a lesson, was that the best protection is not a wall you build when the threat appears. It is a foundation you lay so deep and so solid that by the time anyone tries to take what's yours, there is nothing to take. It is already, irrevocably, exactly where it belongs. He laid that foundation. In the months when he was spending his remaining energy on what most people would have spent on their own comfort, on making peace with the end of things, he was laying it for me. Not because he thought I couldn't fight, he knew I could fight, but because he loved me enough to make sure I wouldn't have to fight with nothing under my feet. I think about that when I drive to the office in the morning. I think about it when I sign a contract or sit across from a client or stand in the yard watching the fleet move. I think about the man who came home on an October evening and set his keys on the counter and started building something with the time he had left. I'm standing on what he built, and I'm building on top of it. To anyone watching this who has worked your whole life for something, with your spouse, your partner, your own two hands, and who feels the creeping anxiety of not knowing whether what you've built is protected, it can be protected. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the specific grief of discovering that some of the people you trusted most were not who you believed them to be. But it can be done. You have the right to protect what is yours. You have the right to ask hard questions about who is standing close to you and what they want. You have the right to name the thing you see even when everyone around you is suggesting that what you see isn't there. You have the right to draw lines that others will call unreasonable and hold them anyway. And you have the right, if you are lucky enough to have a person in your life who would spend their last months building a wall to protect you, to honor that gift by standing behind it and building something worth protecting. Walter Bennett gave me that gift. I am spending the rest of my life being worthy of it. The fleet stands at 51 vehicles now. Dennis is talking about a new regional route that could add 3 more contracts by spring. Ethan is 8 months into his certification program and calls on Sunday evenings with questions that are getting sharper and more specific every week. The questions of someone who is actually learning rather than going through motions. The farmhouse is quieter than it used to be. I have learned to live inside that quiet without fighting it. Some evenings I sit at the kitchen table with the legal pad that still has last month's expense notes on it, and I work, and the refrigerator hums the same way it always has, and the land outside the window is dark the way land gets in the fall when the days shorten. And I think about 31 years and everything that was built and everything that was almost taken and everything that held. I think about an envelope with my name written in terrible handwriting. I think about a voice saying, "You'll know, I knew." And for everyone who has watched this story to the end, thank you. Not a small thank you, the kind you say automatically, but the real kind. You sat with a hard story for a long time and you let it mean something, and that matters more than I can say. If this story found you at a moment when you're holding something you're afraid of losing, I hope it reminded you that what you built has more strength than fear gives it credit for. And I hope it reminded you that protecting yourself, setting limits, refusing to hand over what you've earned, that is not hardness, that is dignity, that is exactly what you are allowed to want. In September, 8 months after Walter died, I drove out to the far edge of the property on a Saturday morning. There's a place out there where the land rises slightly, and you can see the full length of the lower fields and, on a clear day, the highway in the distance where our trucks run. Walter used to walk out there on weekend mornings when something was weighing on him. I had always known he went there, but I had never followed him, because some people need their space to think. And Walter was one of them, and I had learned to respect that. I walked out there with my coffee, and I stood in the September air and I looked at the highway. 2 of our trucks passed while I was standing there. I recognized them by the fleet markings. We had updated the livery in July, a small change Dennis and I had decided on together, modernizing the logo slightly while keeping the color scheme Walter had chosen 20 years ago. The trucks looked good. They looked like what they were, part of a fleet that was operating and growing and not for sale. I stood there for a long time. I thought about what the past 8 months had required of me. Not just the legal maneuvering, not just the strategic responses to Vivian's various approaches, but the smaller things. Learning to sleep in the middle of the bed instead of on my side. Learning to make coffee for one. Learning to sit at the dining room table with papers spread out and no one across from me to say, "What are you working on, Maggie?" in the distracted way Walter said it when he was thinking about something else and just wanted to hear my voice. Learning that I was capable of carrying things I had assumed required 2 people to carry. That last one was the hardest lesson and the most important one. Not because it proved I was strong. I already knew I was strong, in the way that most people who have built something from nothing already know they are strong. It was hard because accepting it meant accepting that Walter was really gone, that this wasn't a temporary situation I was managing until he came back, that the company, the farmhouse, the land, the Sunday evening phone calls with Ethan, the relationship with Dennis and Harold and Patricia, all of it was now mine to carry on my own terms, not as an extension of a partnership, but as its own thing. That took longer to accept than any legal document or strategic decision. Some mornings, I was still accepting it. I want to talk to you directly for a moment, if that's all right. Not as Margaret Bennett, not inside the story, but as someone who has been thinking about what this experience means and who wants to say something about it that the narrative alone can't quite carry. There is a thing that happens to people who build something slowly over decades with their hands and their judgment and their willingness to sacrifice. They begin to assume that the thing they built is safe simply because they built it. They trust the people around them the way you trust the house you live in, not because you've recently inspected the foundation, but because you've been standing in it a long time and it hasn't fallen yet. I made that mistake. I trusted the shape of my family without looking at what was inside it. What Vivian taught me, and I use that word deliberately because even the people who harm us teach us something if we pay attention, was that proximity is not the same as loyalty. That someone can sit at your table, eat your food, smile in your direction for years, and be building an entirely different structure than the one you thought you were all constructing together. That the people most likely to reach for what you've built are the ones already inside the door. And what Walter taught me, what he had in fact been teaching me for 31 years without ever calling it a lesson, was that the best protection is not a wall you build when the threat appears. It is a foundation you lay so deep and so solid that by the time anyone tries to take what's yours, there is nothing to take. It is already, irrevocably, exactly where it belongs. He laid that foundation. In the months when he was spending his remaining energy on what most people would have spent on their own comfort, on making peace with the end of things, he was laying it for me. Not because he thought I couldn't fight, he knew I could fight, but because he loved me enough to make sure I wouldn't have to fight with nothing under my feet. I think about that when I drive to the office in the morning. I think about it when I sign a contract or sit across from a client or stand in the yard watching the fleet move. I think about the man who came home on an October evening and set his keys on the counter and started building something with the time he had left. I am standing on what he built, and I am building on top of it. To anyone watching this who has worked your whole life for something, with your spouse, your partner, your own two hands, and who feels the creeping anxiety of not knowing whether what you've built is protected, it can be protected. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the specific grief of discovering that some of the people you trusted most were not who you believed them to be. But it can be done. You have the right to protect what is yours. You have the right to ask hard questions about who is standing close to you and what they want. You have the right to name the thing you see, even when everyone around you is suggesting that what you see isn't there. You have the right to draw lines that others will call unreasonable and hold them anyway. And you have the right, if you are lucky enough to have a person in your life who would spend their last months building a wall to protect you, to honor that gift by standing behind it and building something worth protecting. Walter Bennett gave me that gift. I am spending the rest of my life being worthy of it. The fleet stands at 51 vehicles now. Dennis is talking about a new regional route that could add 3 more contracts by spring. Ethan is 8 months into his certification program and calls on Sunday evenings with questions that are getting sharper and more specific every week, the questions of someone who is actually learning rather than going through motions. The farmhouse is quieter than it used to be. I have learned to live inside that quiet without fighting it. Some evenings I sit at the kitchen table with the legal pad that still has last month's expense notes on it, and I work. And the refrigerator hums the same way it always has, and the land outside the window is dark the way land gets in the fall when the days shorten. And I think about 31 years and everything that was built, and everything that was almost taken, and everything that held. I think about an envelope with my name written in terrible handwriting. I think about a voice saying, "You'll know, I knew." And for everyone who has watched this story to the end, thank you. Not a small thank you, the kind you say automatically, but the real kind. You sat with a hard story for a long time, and you let it mean something, and that matters more than I can say. If this story found you at a moment when you're holding something you're afraid of losing, I hope it reminded you that what you built has more strength than fear gives it credit for. And I hope it reminded you that protecting yourself, setting limits, refusing to hand over what you've earned, that is not hardness. That is dignity. That is exactly what you are allowed to want. And for everyone who has watched this story to the end, thank you. Not a small thank you, the kind you say automatically, but the real kind. You sat with a hard story for a long time, and you let it mean something, and that matters more than I can say. If this story found you at a moment when you're holding something you're afraid of losing, I hope it reminded you that what you built has more strength than fear gives it credit for. And I hope it reminded you that protecting yourself, setting limits, refusing to hand over what you've earned, that is not hardness. That is dignity. That is exactly what you are allowed to want.